Hello, my name is Julia Streets and I am delighted to be the moderator for today's webinar. It's part two of a two-part series brought to you by Refinitiv and The TRADE. It's all about FX trading, automation and liquidity access. And throughout this mini-series, they had discussion from industry experts all about understanding market behaviour, automation, and particularly during these COVID-19 times, navigating markets as they are today, and then of course what this means for the future. So in part one, which is now available to download, the focus was on FX trading automation, where next for the buy side. Now, these two sessions aren't necessarily sequential, so when you get a link to both of them, you can watch them in any order. And in part two, the one we're recording today, we're really focused on navigating fragmented FX markets, thinking about optimizing your liquidity blend and improving your execution outcomes. So thank you so much for joining us today, and allow me to introduce our speakers. We're joined today by Daniel Chambers, who's the head of trading at Sequoia Capital Fund Management. Now, Daniel's responsible for all aspects of trading. He's constantly working to reduce trading costs and also to reap the benefits of trading efficiency right the way through the workflow. So if you think about building execution algorithms and the implementation of trading cost analytics tools. He oversees each part of the trading through communication with liquidity providers, aggregators, prime brokers, and his experience has been not only across multiple asset classes, but right the way across. He's also worked as head of back office, where he designed and built a prototype for the organisation's current procedures that still apply today. And then he's handed it off to a development team, so very much works with developers and technologists as well. So Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful to see you today. Thank you. We'll be looking forward to your thoughts as we go through this conversation. And our other guest today is Bart, Joris, who is the head of FX sell-side trading proposition management at Refinitiv. Now, he has held a role here at Refinitiv for 3.5 years now as head of FX sell-side trading proposition management. But prior to this, he was proposition manager of FX pricing and hedging at Thomson Reuters, and that was for about 2 years. Now, if you go back through Bart's career, he also has very strong insights born from a tenure at ING, where he managed globally the e-commerce for ING for foreign exchange, as well as fixed income and also equities. And also his focus very much lay in the emerging area around business development and FX algo trading. So it's going to be a fantastic conversation. I can feel it already. And this is all about navigating fragmented markets and thinking again about optimizing your liquidity blend, about getting the best possible execution. So Bart, I'm going to come to you first of all. I think the burning question that I would ask is, why is this conversation important right now? Why should the audience really care right now?
Thank you, Julia. I think when you take a look into the world, there is always something which is happening, and liquidity is always a hot topic in the way how it actually plays in. We just come out of the COVID-19, let's call it, we're still in the middle of it, maybe even the second wave. So I think it is one of those topics which actually really influences the market. But it could be any topic actually into it, which drives you to actually your liquidity pool to see how it is constructed, how it builds up, and what it actually the effects are of any event which actually sits into it. So it comes all back to what is your choice of liquidity you're using, how do you use it, and what is also the way how you actually really execute into the market. So how coherent is your liquidity? How do you actually aggressive, passive? How do you actually do that execution which you're actually looking for, and making sure you're actually having the right liquidity for you inside. As a result, you need to be equipped with the right diversity of tools as well liquidity to make sure you can execute on the liquidity needs you're having at any moment in time, also during crisis periods. So we as Refinitiv, we are also trying to help in there. So we are actually an open platform where we actually try to bring liquidity next to ourselves also from different competitors. We are bringing aggregators to life, which actually allows you to bring the fragmented market back into one view and give you the opportunity to execute over the broad liquidity. And we actually focus to make sure that we can actually get duplication of liquidity out of the market. So I think it's a very hot topic due to the events which are happening, but it is one which actually exists already for years into the market and for the coming years still to go.
And I think for me, the big word that came out of that was all about the open approach to navigating the markets at the moment. And Daniel, let me come to you at this point, because as I mentioned in my introduction, a big focus for you is all about liquidity optimization and using your TCA tools. I'm very keen, actually, because I know your focus has been upon building really effective range of tools to analyze your liquidity to really granular levels as well. And I suppose my big question is why? How does this all come together in delivering real impact and ultimately savings of performance?
Well, it's over the last 5 to 10 years, it has been a learning curve. And prior to being able to optimize that liquidity, we had to have some reasoning and sound base for our starting point. And so initially, trading spot G10, the natural move was to connect to kind of the top of Euromoney type institutions and some regional players, and then went on to introduce some non-banks. Now, what we then did was, having built our TCA in-house, which allowed us to monitor our costs either on the aggregate level or per cross and so on, we moved away from just monitoring them to being able to try to identify what is the underlying reasons that we're incurring, whether that be greater spreads or increased market impact or slippage. And one of the natural places to look is, what are my counterparties doing or liquidity providers doing when I execute with them? And doing that and kind of policing the LPs, you really get an idea for the differences between them in how they interact with you. So some may be internalizing or able to release it into the market in a way such that it's not giving away too much information, whereas others are literally just turning it around and there's a lot of information leakage. Now, depending on how you're executing, if you're executing large parent orders over multiple clips and you're in the market every X number of seconds or minutes, if you've got the counterparty who is constantly creating market impact and information leakage, then you're really hurting yourself, because by the time you get to clip 10, 20 and so on, you're not executing any longer at the price where you started. And that's a real problem. And a lot of our work was alpha preservation through execution costs or lowering.
Which ultimately is the game, isn't it? And when you think about, I talked there in the question about the granular level of detail, is being right on top of this, literally kind of millisecond by millisecond, minute by minute as well. But we have been navigating quite extraordinary times, and I think particularly about the amount of volatility in the market. You might call it a COVID-19 spike in volatility. And keen to come back to you, Bart, and just think about, I guess, what have we learned as we've been navigating these volatile times?
I think, I just want to stress, COVID-19 is one of those events which actually really stressed the market very deep, but there are many others which actually continuously happen, and it's always the unknown which actually triggers what happens within to it. When you look to the COVID-19 piece and the evolution where the market was at that moment and the liquidity which comes along with it, I think it was one of the pieces which are very important, was that we saw actually a drive from relationship trading activity. So when you actually look, and maybe I'll explain this a little bit more and deeper, when you look to the market structure, we actually have 3 different liquidity pools in the way how we see the market from it. We have what we call relationship trading liquidity, which is based on a relationship. Is it now your personal relationship? Is it a relationship based on credit? Is it a relationship based on where your activity as a bank is? Or even where you have your contracts running with? You have liquidity which is done through exchanges, which means the futures, and these can be cash futures as real futures, and the ECNs, which are actually the order books which actually playing. So you have 3 different individual liquidity pools where you can actually tap liquidity out of it, and every part of it has its own sense and where execution sits into it. At this moment, the market is an enormous focus around relationship trading, and that relationship trading is one of the easiest and cheapest, probably the cheapest way how you can actually execute into it, but also triggers immediately the effect of, if something happens into the market, that spreads are going to go wider, because it actually provides you immediately the effects of what the uncertainty sits within the market, or the risk which are actually coming about with taking on bigger risk. Like, for example, the clips of 5, 10, where Dan was actually talking about, immediately absorbing it, able to internalize, is always a difficulty when you sit in that relationship trading, when you actually pass that risk into one pool where it needs to be absorbed. The ECN traders, where the ECN venues, they actually have a different principle, where you actually work much more on an all-to-all market. Not everything is the same, but the idea is it is an all-to-all market, which means you participate with a lot of other people into that market, and you're on an even level with everybody who sits into it. Normally, when you execute, everybody can hit the price which you put in, or when you take liquidity, the price which is available towards you, which means you normalizes much more the liquidity at that moment. But that comes as a price. That's not the cheapest part where it sits into it, so it is a more expensive way of working into it. Then when you work on exchanges, you have different ways how you actually can do that, but there you have the big step. When it's a real future, you need to actually, if you want to do spot, you need to actually swap it out. Or when you actually want to have the swap, you need to take the spot element out of it. So that's a more complicated work. And in general, is something which is fast growing because it's real time, it's all to all, and it's actually cleared. So you take actually all the pieces of what is important for an exchange to actually operate into it and the risks away. On the other hand, it is more complex to actually trade on it. What we saw in the COVID is that people tend to go back towards the ECNs and stepped away from relationship trading based on spreads, which went higher, until the people said, I don't actually want to pay that extra price, and I go back into the ECN market. So I think that's one of the factors, and you see that almost with every volatility, automatically that switch from liquidity pool to the other liquidity pool, due to the fact of how the cost structure based on your execution is actually coming in.
So I'm really fascinated to ask the audience, actually, in terms of which liquidity pools they've been they are currently using, because as we record this, we are of course still very much in lockdown, even though different organisations are coming out of it in different states. So the question to the audience is, what liquidity pools do you currently use? And there are a number of options. So is it bank, non-bank direct liquidity, multi-provider liquidity, primary market central limit order book liquidity, secondary market ECN order book liquidity, exchange liquidity, or another? And if you do have another, you can submit your answer via the Q&A. So just while we're waiting for those results to come in, it's a slightly interesting question to ask you this one, but can you predict? Can you anticipate what you think the audience might say? Daniel, let me come to you first of all. How do you see these numbers coming in?
I think you're likely to get most of them, if not all of them, from someone. Maybe not other, but I would guess that you would get all the others at least. Ourselves, bank and non-bank, and also some ECN for passive trading. But I'm sure with the different spectrum of buy side participants here, you're likely to get all of those probably.
Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to say that the results are coming in, so I think we can now reveal the responses, and a very clear winner, actually. I think I don't know if that's percentage on the left axis, but certainly a very clear winner is the bank, non-bank direct liquidity, followed by the multi-provider liquidity, and then exchange liquidity and primary markets sort of come in pretty closely as well. Bart, is that what you would have expected as well?
For sure. I think the way how the people operate and the way how people look to costs, which is mainly around direct cost, and I know Dan already evolved into actually looking for impact and what the cost is of impact when you do executions. A lot of people are still focused on what is my direct cost, which means is there brokerage involved with it or is there no brokerage involved with it, makes a big difference in the way how the execution works. So a lot of people take then immediately the direct liquidity, which comes actually free of charge, at least indirect costs, as a result out of it. So I think it's a very important signal to the market how that evolution still needs to blend further in when you actually have the bigger amounts, that it's not only the cost of brokerage which is important, but also the cost of the TCA, like Dan was explaining, the cost, how you can actually internalize even yourself, and actually also use the other liquidity pools, because when spreads goes up, you actually pay a lot of value away, and your alpha actually is disappearing quickly in the spreads you're paying. While if you participate at certain moments in different markets, it doesn't mean you always have to be there. So this is the point of fragmentation. It doesn't mean you have to act on every moment in time on the same venue. Every venue and every pool has its own purpose of usage. So you can actually have, if you're more an aggressive player, you would actually go more to the ECN sides than actually hitting single banks, because single banks, when you actually are very aggressive, they also will need to go to the market to actually protect themselves. That's not a model which leans into it, and it depends on time and it depends on execution style. So I think what I see here is not a surprise. I think that's what most people could have predicted. I do think people need to think, and the analysis, and banks provide also TCA, but against what are you benchmarking against yourself or against what the general pieces are, very important. And I'm sure Dan can actually even provide even more information around this.
Well, I was going to ask Daniel, when you were saying at the beginning about, anticipating a spread as well, but we have a skew, which is fascinating. Any thoughts from you?
Yes, so with regards to benchmarking, first of all, we used a number of different benchmarks, not just the spread, but we were looking at, what is the market impact while, since our first clip. We were also measuring prior to the first clip being executed, and if we were, for example, entering passively, we were looking at what is that slippage between placing the order and actually getting our first fill, because there might be some bias towards some sort of time risk depending on what your alpha period or your holding period looks like, and then also between actually the signal and entering the market. So depending on the different strategies, you could be losing alpha just by taking too long between generating the signal and entering the market. And then with regards to skew, that's something we were really looking at, because when we talk about optimizing liquidity and we talk about using a bank versus an ECN and so on, what we were trying to do was execute at opportunistic times. So take banks out of risk, for example, or help them to reduce their inventory. So we were monitoring the market in our execution algos, and we were looking for banks that were skewed one way or the other, depending on which way we were going. And then if we deemed them to be skewed, we would execute with them maybe slightly higher volume or slightly quicker. However, that does lead to something else, which is if you have a counterparty showing skew to multiple different clients and they naively pull that skew from everywhere they're showing it because you've taken them out of skew, although you were doing something quite clever and you were reducing their inventory, there's actually information leakage possible due to them pulling skew. So they don't even need to trade elsewhere, but literally it's just to pull their skew from everywhere. So there's a lot involved in making sure or trying not to create market impact.
And of course, it's an art form, isn't it? And I'd like to now move the conversation on, if I may, to the conversation about algorithms. Again, I've mentioned in both your introductions, this is something you're very keenly focused on throughout your careers. And of course, we think about the evolution and the pace of adoption around algorithms. And my really big question, driving question really is, is there an adoption of algorithms across the board, or do we see that they're appropriate for particular elements of the market, or a select few, arguably? And talk to us a bit about the role that technology can play in creating that optimal liquidity blend that we talked about at the beginning. Daniel, I'm going to come to you first of all, if we may. I'd love to hear your thoughts around the evolution and adoption of algos.
So we used algos for 100% of our trading, pretty much, 99.9 maybe. But we were in a very privileged position of trading G10 spot. Now, in that space, algorithms are used quite a lot. There's a lot of liquidity all throughout the European hours, which is what we were trading. Now, I don't think algorithms are necessary for everybody, because you have others who are trading more exotic pairs. They may be trading EM, or they may be trading NDFs, forwards and futures and so on. So for us, it worked, but it's not a one size fits all. However, in my experience, when you execute using an algo, you build up nice, clean data sets, and you increase your sample size, and you're able to better analyze what you're doing right and wrong, because you've got consistency in the execution style. You don't have variables that are outside of your control, or that could be shifting depending on a trader and different things. So I like the adoption of execution algos. I can see why some people still want to either trade on the screen or call up somebody very quickly, though. That's one of the things we were trying to do in our execution algo with the skew. It's almost like in the old, when you would call up somebody and say, do you have size in this? Well, what you're doing is you're trying to look at it on the screen and see and get this same bit of information, but you're letting the algo do it instead of having to call somebody up. So I think it will continue to increase, though, the adoption of execution algos.
And Bart, you're serving a broad church of the community, let's call it that. So I love your thoughts as well. Do they tally with what Daniel was just saying, or do you see a particular trend?
So I think it's right what Daniel was saying. So it's not given for everybody. Let's call it like this, and it will be always another execution method which sits into it. So you have different kinds of algos where we actually talk from. We have position algos. We have actually alpha generating algos. We have alpha generating execution algos. We have the real pure execution algos. You have them where you're actually part of an internalization pool. You have them where you're actually part of a straight through almost PB model, PB model, which actually comes into it. So you have different kind of algos which are actually in the world, and they all have its role to play in that purpose. Though not everybody is actually equipped with the right tools to actually do so, although we think everybody sits into it, there is always the fear from also, do I actually get a better result or not? And I think this is one thing which I always want to say around fragmentation, because algos is also to a certain extent fueling the fragmentation, because some of the people think the more I can spread it around with an algo, the more I actually have a less of a footprint, which is in essence not really true, because many is recycled liquidity which actually comes back, and it depends in the way how you actually really use your algos which are in there. The second piece which comes in is, how do you really benchmark, and that's a discussion which you had earlier, how do you really benchmark your algo is actually better performing than what you're doing manually? I do agree 100%. Your results which are coming back when you execute out of an algo, they are very clean in terms of your data sets, how you can analyze it and actually which sits into it. But give you the simplest example, if you do a simple TWAP, and this is for a lot of people the case, doing it every 5 seconds and you click on a mouse, or doing it with a system, it just, and an algo to actually do this, it just helps you to actually improve your quality of execution by not doing it yourself. So there is purpose of use for any algo which actually sits there in the market, but it will not be a given for everybody to actually be applied to.
Thank you very much for your thoughts on that. And what I'm delighted to say is we've actually had an audience question come in as well. And let me read the question, and then you can elect who would like to take it. I'm keen to hear from both of you. The question that's come in is about electronic forward disclosed bilateral liquidity that still allegedly lacks transparency. Why is this? Who would like to take that question about electronic forward disclosed bilateral liquidity that allegedly still lacks transparency?
I'll start, and then maybe somebody can pick in. So sure. From my side, so the forward market is still a very manual processed world. So it is still one of those markets which is dominated even on the interbank market by voice brokers. There are the emerging electronic systems are actually coming into the market as we speak. Even we as Refinitiv, we are actually doing extra work on it to make sure that it becomes API driven instead of actually human driven. And as a result out of it, the data points which you actually get out of it, or the more erratic ways how it actually works, this is what Daniel already referred to, those clean data sets when you actually work in a pure discovered market where you actually do everything electronic, is not yet there. So as a result out of it, it is very unclear where that market sits. And surely when you go to big points into the market like IMM dates or turnover dates, end of year dates, where it becomes very difficult to price the credit aspect into it, it becomes actually a very unclear market where price discovery is not that easy, and as a result actually the transparency disappears into it. As the market evolves more to an electronic market, slowly more and more, you will see that actually the electronic pieces will pick up, and that the transparency which actually gives the electronic market will actually prevail and provide that to the market as well.
And Daniel, presumably, you mentioned earlier about the importance of analytics, and exactly as Bart was saying there, the more electronic it becomes. Is that something you're focused on at the moment?
So I agree with what was said. I think as the market develops and you start to, everyone starts to have a bit more information, a bit better understanding of where the forwards should be priced. When the electronification there's an uptick in the forward space, I think it will start to naturally become more transparent. It's not something we're focusing on ourselves because we did have a strategy trading forwards and so on, but the primary focus for us is execution algos focused on spot. But I can see that everything Bart has said makes sense and is logical. It will get there, but we're still, it's only recently that last look is no longer something everyone's talking about constantly. So it will take time, but it will get there, I think.
Wonderful. Well, it's been an amazing conversation. We've been thinking about liquidity trends, thinking about the TCA and the analytics around that, thinking about views from the audience about where they are mostly executing at the moment, and then also other considerations to take into account. And then, of course, the adoption and the application of algorithms as well. Daniel and Bart, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for joining us today. And I'd like to take this moment actually to thank both The Trade and Refinitiv, and particularly to the audience for participating in the survey and also for the questions coming in. There is a questionnaire coming to you. Actually, we'd love to hear your feedback on the session and if there are any other topics you think we should be talking about. And as of today, let me wrap up there. We've been talking about navigating fragmented foreign exchange markets, optimising your liquidity blend, and improving your execution outcomes. I've been Julia Streets, and thank you very much for watching.